My boss fired me without severance. So I took the company to court and left with his parking spot. You're done here, Martinez. Clear out your desk and be gone by 5. Richard Hartwell's words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest as I stood in his corner office, the city skyline of Denver stretching behind his imposing mahogany desk. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with leather furniture created an atmosphere that had once intimidated me, but today, it just made me sick. "Sir, I don't understand," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "My performance reviews have been exemplary. The Morrison account I just closed brought in $2 million for the company." Richard leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. At 52, he was everything I despised about corporate America: entitled, arrogant, and completely detached from the people who actually made his company profitable. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit probably cost more than most people made in a month, and his ego filled the room like toxic gas. "Performance reviews don't matter when you're a liability," he said, adjusting his gold cufflinks with deliberate slowness. "We're restructuring and your position has been eliminated." I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides. "What about my severance package? My contract clearly states—" "Your contract?" Richard laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "That was under the old management structure. Things change, Martinez. Maybe next time you'll think twice before getting too comfortable." The way he emphasized Martinez made my skin crawl. I'd worked for Hartwell Industries for 6 years, climbing from junior account executive to senior sales manager through sheer determination and countless 60-hour weeks. "My name is Sofia Martinez. I'm 34 years old, and I'd given everything to this company only to have it thrown back in my face by a man who'd never worked an honest day in his life." "This is illegal," I said quietly, but Richard was already turning his attention to his computer screen, dismissing me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Legal will be in touch if there are any issues with your departure," he said without looking up. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." As I walked out of his office, my mind was racing. The other employees in the bullpen avoided eye contact, their keyboards clicking nervously as they pretended to be absorbed in their work. They knew what had just happened, and they were terrified they might be next. My desk was in the corner by the window, a small space I'd personalized with a few family photos and a plant my grandmother had given me when I first got the job. As I began packing my things into a cardboard box, I noticed Marcus Webb from IT hovering nearby, pretending to fix a printer that was working perfectly fine. "Sophia," he whispered, glancing around nervously, "I'm sorry about what happened. This is really messed up." Marcus was 26, brilliant with computers, and one of the few genuine people left in this corporate wasteland. He'd started as an intern 2 years ago, and I'd taken him under my wing, helping him navigate office politics and avoid Richard's wrath. "Thanks, Marcus," I said, carefully wrapping my grandmother's photo in tissue paper. "Just keep your head down, and don't make waves. I don't want you getting caught up in whatever this is." But Marcus moved closer, his voice dropping even lower. "That's just it, Sophia. I think I know what this is really about." I looked up at him, noting the serious expression on his usually cheerful face. "What do you mean?" "Meet me at Brewster's Coffee tomorrow morning at 8, he said, then louder for anyone listening, "I'll miss working with you. Good luck with everything." That evening, I sat in my small apartment in Capitol Hill, staring at the box of personal items from my office. 6 years of my life reduced to a cardboard container that barely filled half my kitchen table. My laptop was open beside me, displaying my bank account balance, which would last about 2 months if I was careful. I'd moved to Denver from a small town in New Mexico with nothing but a college degree and determination to make something of myself. Working at Hartwell Industries had been my dream job, a chance to use my business degree and prove that a girl from Las Cruces could compete with anyone. But now I felt like a fool for believing that hard work and loyalty meant anything in Richard Hartwell's world. My phone buzzed with text messages from coworkers expressing their shock and sympathy, but beneath their kind words, I could sense their fear. If Richard could fire me without cause or severance, none of them were safe. The company culture had become toxic under his leadership, with employees walking on eggshells and productivity suffering as people focused more on avoiding his wrath than doing their jobs. I thought about my conversation with Richard just 2 weeks earlier, when I'd expressed concerns about some irregularities I'd noticed in the Morrison account billing. He'd brushed off my questions with his usual condescension, telling me to focus on sales and leave the accounting to the professionals. At the time, I'd assumed he was just being his typical dismissive self, but now I wondered if there was more to it. The next morning, I arrived at Brewster's Coffee 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table where we could talk privately. The coffee shop was one of those trendy places with exposed brick walls and baristas who looked like they belonged in indie bands. But the coffee was excellent, and it was far enough from the office that we wouldn't run into anyone from work. Marcus showed up precisely at 8, looking nervous and carrying a laptop bag that seemed heavier than usual. He ordered a double espresso, which told me everything I needed to know about his stress level. "Okay," I said once he'd settled into the chair across from me. "What's this about?" Marcus looked around the coffee shop, then leaned forward. "I've been monitoring the company's network traffic as part of my security responsibilities, and I've noticed some irregularities." "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind that could put Richard Hartwell in federal prison," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sophia, he's been embezzling money from client accounts for months. Small amounts at first, but it's escalated. The Morrison account you closed? Half of that commission money never made it to the company books." I felt my blood turn to ice. "Are you sure?" Marcus opened his laptop and angled the screen toward me. The spreadsheet displayed a series of financial transfers that painted a clear picture of systematic theft. Richard had been skimming money from client payments, manipulating the accounting software to hide the missing funds, and transferring the stolen money to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. "Jesus," I breathed, staring at the evidence displayed on the screen. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 18 months, maybe longer," Marcus replied, scrolling through additional files. "But it's gotten worse recently. He's been taking bigger amounts, getting sloppier with covering his tracks. I think he's planning something big." "Like what?" "Like disappearing with $8 million of company and client money," Marcus said grimly. "I've been tracking his activities, and he's been liquidating assets, closing accounts, and making preparations that look like someone getting ready to run." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Richard stolen my job and my future, but he was planning to steal from everyone else too. The employees whose retirement funds were managed by the company, the clients who trusted us with their money, the vendors who depended on our payments to feed their families. "There's more," Marcus continued, pulling up another file. "He's been falsifying expense reports, charging personal purchases to company accounts, and even stealing from the employee healthcare fund. The Christmas bonuses that got canceled last year? That money went straight into his pocket." I remembered that announcement, how Richard had stood in the conference room with fake regret, explaining that the company couldn't afford bonuses due to market conditions. Meanwhile, he'd been driving around in a new BMW and bragging about his recent vacation to Monaco. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Because I think he fired you to cover his tracks," Marcus explained. "You handled the Morrison account directly. You would have noticed if the commission calculations didn't match your records. He needed you gone before you could piece things together." Suddenly, everything made sense. Richard's dismissive attitude when I'd questioned the billing irregularities, his refusal to honor my severance package, the way he'd seemed almost eager to get rid of me despite my excellent performance. He wasn't restructuring the company, he was eliminating witnesses to his crimes. "We need to go to the police," I said. But Marcus shook his head. We need more than this. What I've shown you is compelling, but a good lawyer could argue that the data was manipulated or taken out of context. Richard has connections in the city, expensive attorneys who specialize in making problems disappear. We need irrefutable proof. What are you suggesting? Marcus closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. I'm suggesting we get creative. Richard thinks he's untouchable, but his arrogance is going to be his downfall. I can help you gather the evidence we need, but it's going to require some risk on both our parts. Over the next 2 hours, Marcus and I developed a plan that was equal parts brilliant and terrifying. He would continue monitoring Richard's activities from inside the company while I worked from the outside to gather additional evidence. The goal was to build an airtight case that would not only expose Richard's crimes, but also ensure that justice was served. There's one more thing, Marcus said as we prepared to leave. Richard's been bragging to his golf buddies about how he's planning to buy a new yacht with his recent bonus. He's getting sloppy, which means he's going to make mistakes. How do you know about his golf conversations? Marcus smiled for the first time that morning. Let's just say that IT has access to more than just computers. The company phone system routes through our servers, including Richard's personal calls from his office line. As I walked home from the coffee shop, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement. For the first time since being fired, I had a purpose, a mission that went beyond just finding another job. Richard Hartwell had made the mistake of underestimating me, and I was going to make sure he regretted it. But first, I needed to secure my own position. I couldn't take on a powerful executive while I was unemployed and financially vulnerable. I spent the rest of the day updating my resume and reaching out to contacts in other companies. By evening, I had 3 potential interviews lined up, including one with a competitor who'd been trying to poach me for months. The first phase of our plan involved me filing a wrongful termination lawsuit against Hartwell Industries. I found an employment attorney named Jennifer Walsh who specialized in cases involving corporate misconduct. Jennifer was in her 40s, sharp as a razor, and had a reputation for taking on powerful executives who thought they were above the law. Your case is interesting, Jennifer said during our initial consultation in her downtown office. Firing someone without cause just before they're eligible for a major commission payout is definitely suspicious, but proving it will require more than just your word against his. What if I told you I had reason to believe my termination was connected to larger criminal activity within the company? I asked carefully. Jennifer's eyebrows raised. I'd say you need to be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. But if you have evidence of criminal wrongdoing, that changes everything. I explained what Marcus had discovered, being careful not to reveal too many details about how we'd obtain the information. Jennifer listened intently, taking notes and asking pointed questions about the company's financial practices and Richard's behavior patterns. If what you're telling me is true, your wrongful termination case becomes the least of Richard Hartwell's problems, she said finally. But we need to be strategic about this. Filing the employment lawsuit first will put him on the defensive and potentially force him to make mistakes while we gather evidence for the larger case. How long do we have before he potentially disappears with the money? Jennifer considered this carefully. Based on what you've described, probably a few months at most. Corporate executives who are planning to flee usually want to time their departure carefully to avoid suspicion. He'll want to finish the current quarter, maybe even wait until after the annual board meeting. While Jennifer prepared the wrongful termination lawsuit, I began my own investigation into Richard's activities. I reached out to former employees who'd left the company under suspicious circumstances, many of whom had stories that supported our theory about Richard's criminal behavior. Sarah Chen, a former accounting manager, told me about discrepancies she'd noticed in the books before being suddenly laid off 6 months earlier. She'd tried to bring the irregularities to Richard's attention, but he'd dismissed her concerns and then eliminated her position during the next round of restructuring. I should have pushed harder, Sarah said during our coffee meeting, but I was scared of losing my job. Ironic, considering I lost it anyway. David Thompson, who'd worked in client relations, described how Richard had pressured him to falsify billing records and inflate charges to certain accounts. When David had refused, he'd been written up for performance issues that had never existed before, eventually leading to his termination. "He made my life hell for 3 months before firing me," David explained. "Constant criticism, impossible deadlines, meetings where he'd humiliate me in front of other staff. I was so stressed I ended up in the hospital with chest pains." Each conversation revealed another piece of the puzzle, another crime that Richard thought he'd covered up. The pattern was clear. Anyone who got too close to his illegal activities was eliminated, either through intimidation or termination. Meanwhile, Marcus was working his magic from inside the company. Using his access to the computer systems, he was able to document Richard's activities in real time, building a comprehensive record of the ongoing embezzlement. He had also discovered that Richard was planning to make a major transfer to his offshore accounts, apparently preparing to disappear with the stolen money. "He's getting desperate," Marcus told me during one of our covert meetings at a different coffee shop across town. "The wrongful termination lawsuit has him spooked. He's been working late, making phone calls to his accountant and lawyer. I think he's planning to make his move soon." "How soon?" "Based on the transfer orders I've seen, probably within the next 2 weeks. Once that money disappears offshore, it'll be almost impossible to recover." That's when I realized we needed to accelerate our timeline. I called Jennifer and explained the urgency of the situation. "If he's planning to flee with the money, we need to move now," she said. "I'll contact the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. With the evidence you've provided, they should be able to get warrants for his accounts and computers." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. FBI agents interviewed me about my experiences at the company, reviewed the evidence Marcus and I had gathered, and began their own investigation into Richard's activities. Special Agent Patricia Collins, who led the Financial Crimes Unit, assured me that they took cases like this very seriously. Corporate embezzlement cases often involve multiple victims and extensive financial damage, Agent Collins explained during our meeting at the federal building. "If your information is accurate, Mr. Hartwell has not only stolen from his company, but also from clients' and employees' retirement funds. We're going to make sure he faces the full consequences of his actions." The FBI moved quickly once they had our evidence. Within 48 hours, they'd obtained warrants for Richard's bank accounts, his computers, and his office. They'd also placed surveillance on him to ensure he didn't try to flee before they could make their arrests. "We've frozen his offshore accounts," Agent Collins informed me during a follow-up call. "He won't be able to access the stolen money, and we're confident we can recover most of it for the victims." The morning of Richard's arrest was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. I wasn't there to see it happen, but Marcus called me with a play-by-play description that made me wish I'd brought popcorn. "They showed up at 9 a.m. with a search warrant," Marcus said, barely able to contain his excitement. "Richard was in his office when they walked in. You should have seen his face when they identified themselves as federal agents. He went completely white, then tried to act like he had no idea what they were talking about." "What happened then?" "They read him his rights and marched him out in handcuffs while everyone watched. The entire office was dead silent except for the sound of his expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor. Then they spent the next 6 hours going through his computer, files, and office safe. They found evidence of crimes we didn't even know about. It turned out that Richard's embezzlement was even more extensive than we'd initially discovered. The FBI found evidence of wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and theft from employee pension funds. He'd been running a sophisticated scheme that involved creating fake vendor accounts, manipulating payroll systems, and even stealing from the company's charitable foundation. The total amount stolen was over $12 million, making it one of the largest corporate embezzlement cases in Colorado history. The investigation revealed that Richard had been living far beyond his means for years, funding an extravagant lifestyle with money stolen from the people who trusted him. But the story was far from over. With Richard behind bars awaiting trial, Hartwell Industries was in chaos. The board of directors called an emergency meeting to assess the damage and determine the company's future. That's when I received a phone call that changed everything. Miss Martinez, this is Robert Hartwell, Richard's father and chairman of the board. The voice on the other end said, I believe we need to talk. Robert Hartwell was nothing like his son. At 71, he was a self-made businessman who'd built Hartwell Industries from nothing, starting with a small construction company and growing it into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. He was clearly disgusted by what Richard had done to the company he'd spent his life creating. My son has disgraced our family name and nearly destroyed everything I worked to build, Robert said during our meeting in his surprisingly modest office. But more importantly, he wronged you and many other good employees who deserved better. I appreciate you saying that, Mr. Hartwell. It's not just words, Ms. Martinez. The board has voted unanimously to offer you a position as interim CEO while we search for permanent leadership. Your investigation into Richard's crimes showed exactly the kind of integrity and intelligence this company needs to recover. I was stunned. Sir, I'm flattered, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to run an entire company. You're more qualified than my son ever was, Robert said with a bitter laugh. He inherited his position and used it to steal from the people who trusted him. You earned your reputation through hard work and moral courage. The board reviewed your employment record, your client relationships, and your performance reviews going back 6 years. You're exactly what we need. The offer was incredible. A salary 5 times what I'd been making, full executive benefits, stock options, and the opportunity to rebuild a company from the ground up. But perhaps more importantly, it was validation that my integrity and hard work meant something. There's one more thing, Robert said, sliding a set of keys across his desk. The executive parking spot right by the front entrance? That was Richard's spot. I think it belongs to you now. 6 months later, I stood in that same corner office where Richard had fired me, but now it was mine. The expensive furniture remained, but I'd replaced his gaudy decorations with family photos and plants that reminded me of home. The view of Denver's skyline looked different from this side of the desk, more hopeful, full of possibilities rather than threats. The company was slowly recovering from the scandal. We'd implemented new financial controls, hired an independent ethics officer, and created an anonymous reporting system for employees to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Many of the clients who'd been victims of Richard's theft had chosen to stay with us, impressed by our commitment to making things right and returning every penny that had been stolen. Marcus had been promoted to Chief Information Officer, and his first priority was ensuring that what happened with Richard could never happen again. He'd implemented new security protocols, regular audits, and transparency measures that made it impossible for anyone to manipulate the financial systems without detection. The other employees who'd been wrongfully terminated or mistreated under Richard's leadership had been offered their jobs back with full back pay and benefits. Sarah Chen had returned as our CFO, bringing the financial expertise and ethical standards we desperately needed. David Thompson had been promoted to Vice President of Client Relations, where his integrity and attention to detail were valued rather than punished. As for Richard himself, the trial had been a spectacle. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his expensive lawyers couldn't overcome the mountain of documentation that Marcus and I had helped the FBI compile. He'd pled guilty to 15 federal charges and been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The judge had been particularly harsh in his sentencing, noting that Richard had betrayed the trust of his employees, clients, and family. You used your position of power and privilege to steal from people who depended on you, the judge had said during sentencing. Your crimes weren't just about money, they were about the destruction of trust, the violation of faith, and the betrayal of everyone who believed in you. All of Richard's assets had been seized to pay restitution to his victims, including the yacht he'd never gotten to buy, the luxury cars he'd purchased with stolen money, and the vacation home in Aspen that had been funded by employee retirement contributions. But my revenge wasn't complete until the day I drove my modest Honda Civic into that executive parking spot right by the front entrance. The brass nameplate that had once read R. Hartwell CEO now read S. Martinez CEO, and every morning when I saw it, I smiled. The best part wasn't the title or the salary or even the satisfaction of seeing justice served. It was knowing that Richard's arrogance and criminal behavior had ultimately elevated the very person he'd tried to destroy. He'd fired me to cover his tracks, but instead, he'd set in motion the events that led to his downfall and my rise. During quiet moments in my office, I often thought about that day when Richard had dismissed me so cruelly, so certain that he held all the power. He'd underestimated the quiet accountant from New Mexico, who paid attention to details and believed in doing the right thing. That underestimation had cost him everything. Sometimes former colleagues would ask me if I felt bad about what happened to Richard, if I ever regretted the role I'd played in his destruction. The answer was always the same. I felt bad for his victims, for the employees whose retirement funds he'd stolen, for the clients he'd defrauded, for the father whose life's work he'd nearly destroyed. But I felt no sympathy for a man who'd used his position of power to hurt innocent people. The wrongful termination lawsuit had been settled quickly once the criminal charges were filed, with the company paying me substantial damages for the illegal firing. But money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was walking into that office every morning, sitting in that chair, and knowing that justice had been served. Richard Hartwell had taught me an important lesson about power and revenge. He'd shown me that sometimes the best way to defeat someone is to let them defeat themselves. His arrogance, his crimes, and his cruelty had been the instruments of his own destruction. I'd simply been smart enough to document it all and make sure the right people saw the evidence. As I looked out at the Denver skyline from my corner office, I couldn't help but smile. The girl from Las Cruces who'd come to the big city with nothing but determination had not only survived, but thrived. Richard Hartwell had tried to destroy me, but instead, he'd given me everything I'd ever wanted: success, respect, and the satisfaction of knowing that good people can still win. And every morning when I parked in his old spot, I was reminded that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and making sure that justice is served. Richard would spend the next 25 years thinking about that lesson from his federal prison cell, while I spent my days rebuilding the company he'd nearly destroyed and helping the people he'd hurt. The brass nameplate by the parking spot gleamed in the morning sun, and I couldn't have been prouder to see my name there. Sofia Martinez, CEO, a title I'd earned through integrity, intelligence, and the courage to fight back when someone tried to silence me. Richard Hartwell had fired me without severance, thinking he could make me disappear. Instead, he'd created his own replacement and handed me the keys to his kingdom. That was a mistake he'd have 25 years to regret.